Okay, we got one more story. It's about Afghanistan, and we're gonna skip a few others, leave them for tomorrow or Thursday, and then we're gonna get into the debate. So, with the Taliban's interpretation of Sharia law, they believe that the very ancient Buddha statues from the 6th century were idols, and so they went on a campaign of cultural erasure and destroyed these statues, since they didn't fall in line with their religious interpretations and their beliefs as a government. I don't think it's emphasized enough when we talk about the Afghanistan war how absolutely disgusting and repulsive the Taliban is. If I can find, let's see if I can find polling on this quick. Taliban polling, Afghanistan. Okay, the survey of the of the Afghan people. This is a really hmm. Okay. Let's see. Let's see data. Let's see the data. Okay, let's see if this is it, because I want to get polling on the Taliban. Let's do the survey of the Afghan people. Let's see if we can actually find any data on the Taliban and what people think of it. But if I remember correctly, and this is from data I saw a while ago, the majority of Afghans do not like the American military, but an even higher amount of Afghans don't like the Taliban. Like, really do not like the Taliban. So let's go through this. Okay. Let's download the PDF quick. Okay. Can we find some keywords? Taliban. We do. There's a lot of instances of Taliban coming up. Okay. Blanket amnesty provided for Talibans by region. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Come on. I want to find Taliban peace. Slightly over half of those interviewed say the peace is achievable within the next 2 years, while 34.3% say that it's not. Males are more likely than females to say peace is achievable. Okay. Among those who say peace was not achievable, to include Okay, so among the 34.3% who indicated peace was not achievable, the most cited answers to why not include interference by other countries, the government and the Taliban are too far apart, violence and fighting are continuing, and the Taliban are not interested in peace. So influenced by other countries. So this could be a lot of factors for that being the top one. This could be the United States. This could be Pakistan. This could be a lot of countries in the region. But I would say the two main factors would probably be the United States and Pakistan. Respondents were asked if they believe that people like them are successfully represented in efforts to negotiate peace with the Taliban. Okay, so let's get into the important tidbits. Respondents were asked how important it is to protect a number of areas as part of the peace process. This is the stuff that I think is where the Taliban is shown to be how much their agenda is despised in Afghanistan. Respondents were asked how important it is to protect a number of areas as part of the peace process, including the current constitution, a democratic system, a strong central government, freedom of press, and women's rights. In regard to areas in which respondents said it's very important, the most cited answers included a strong central government and women's rights. 84.7% said women's rights was a major thing for them. So, the reason why women's rights is such an important part of this is that the Taliban, one of their big major agenda points is basically fuck women's rights. They do not have a history of women's rights when they governed, and their current agenda is not very happy about women's rights. If you look up Taliban women's rights, you're not going to get a feminist manifesto, okay? Taliban women's rights. Other restrictions for women were women should not appear in the street without a blood relative or wearing a burqa. Women should not wear high-heeled shoes, as no man should hear a woman's footsteps, lest it excite him. Women must not speak loudly in public, as no stranger should hear a woman's voice. News. Women in Afghanistan worry peace accord with Taliban extremists could cost them hard-won rights. Honor the sacrifices of Afghan women. A blunt U.S. letter aims to revive the Afghan peace process, but jolts women on a special day. Anyway, so what I'm trying to get here is, if 84% of Afghans, no, basically 85, it's 84.7. So almost 9 out of every 10 Afghans say women's rights being preserved is an important part of the peace process. And on the other end of the negotiating table is the Taliban, then you can see the problem here. That if you want a long-lasting peace process, in my opinion, you should be listening to the majority of the Afghan people, which clearly are stating here that women's rights is part of the agenda. So how do we make it so this is something the Taliban cave on and not the Afghan government caves on? And equality among different groups of people, regardless of ethnicity. Protection of the current constitution was reported as very important by the overwhelming majority. Roughly 1/5 of the respondents said it was very important to protect the presence of foreign military forces. While almost half said it was important to protect the peace deal. So wait. So you said, so actually, if in Afghanistan, 1/5 of respondents said that it was important to protect, almost 25%, the presence of foreign military forces, meaning that 1/5 of all Afghans said that their basic top priority is the keeping of basically American troops within Afghanistan. This probably is rooted in a deep distrust of the Taliban. Again, something that is not talked about at length here, definitely on Lefty Spaces Online, is how much the Afghan people despise the Taliban to such an extent that many of them would be willing to put up with the American military presence in comparison to the Taliban. Which is why when we have this withdrawal, because a lot of this not only good for Afghanistan for us to eventually leave, it's good for us to want to leave because we don't want our troops to keep dying there. We need to make sure that this is a strong peace deal which preserves women's rights, preserves a strong central government, because a weak central government will mean the eventual collapse of it. Because when you see the number one issue being a strong central government for these people, what they're basically saying is, if we don't have a strong central government, then Kabul is going to fall to the Taliban. And they don't want it to fall to the Taliban. Real shame that the hard-won rights of Afghan women in the 60s and 70s were thrown to the dogs and put back 50 years with support of the U.S. It's not that simple, because here's another thing, right? When we look at the Soviet-Afghan War, which is what you're talking about, Cradbabs, the Russian government was probably one of the most disgusting and brutal forces to ever touch Afghanistan. Actually, I'll go further. I'll say that the Soviet army was the worst thing to ever happen to Afghanistan. I will repeat that. The Soviet army was the worst thing to ever happen to Afghanistan. Please leave me a taco, okay? Okay. There's only one? Got it. Okay, cool. So I will say the Soviet army was the worst thing to ever happen to Afghanistan. That's not to say that the Mujahideen and the money we gave to Pakistan, which was then funneled into the Mujahideen, which one of the splinter groups was then ended up being the Taliban after the civil war with the Northern Alliance, etc., etc. The rest is history. But let me just show you how bad the Soviets did Afghanistan. What we did to Iraq in terms of stabilization. No, it's actually worse. I would argue what the Soviets did were worse. I would say what we did in Iraq was horrific, but it was worse. If we go to the size and population density of Afghanistan and how many people were killed by the Soviet army per capita, it was a slaughter. Wasn't colonization by the UK comparable? Okay, let me put it this way. Population Afghanistan. This is an important graph you can always look at if you ever talking to like some imbecile who thinks the Soviets like came to Afghanistan to liberate it. This is a graph of Afghanistan's population from 1960 to today. It's the blue line. Do you guys notice anything weird about this blue line? You see that dip that starts at about 1979 and goes on to about 1990 before you start to see some recovery? That's the Soviet-Afghan War. That's the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. There is not a lot of wars in history where you can actually see this effect listed in real time. This is one of the few wars where you can see it. That is absolutely disgusting, and it is a horrific result of the Soviet invasion and their massive raise the ground bombing campaign. This is like, you don't see this a lot. Like, it's for example, another example where you could probably see it would be Syria population, right? This is another example where you see it, where you realize just how destructive the Syrian civil war is. But yeah, let's look at Soviet-Afghan War. Let's look at the death toll. Okay. So, the strength. Okay, got it. Casualties for the Soviet Union. Man, that's pretty bad. Okay. Oof, this is really bad. Okay, so you got 15,000 Soviet forces and 53,000 wounded. So altogether, that's about like, what, 70,000 casualties? And all this equipment and all this stuff like that. The Soviet estimation, though, is about 23,000 killed and 3,000 officers, with 18,000 Afghan forces killed as well. Yeah, okay, got it. Sounds about right, on top of the 53,753 wounded. On the Mujahideen, that's 90,000 casualties, including 56,000 killed, 17,000 wounded, 150,000 to 180,000 other casualties. Pakistan, 6,000 wounded. Okay. Then you get to civilians. 562,000 to 2 million. With around 3 million Afghans wounded. That's a range of about 2 million to 5 million Afghan civilian casualties. That's near Holocaust levels at the top end. And remember, the Holocaust was amongst multiple countries, and what the numbers I'm talking about right there aren't even including the official military casualties of the actual Mujahideen and Soviet Union fighting. If you include that, that's like an extra 50 to 100,000. And you got to remember, this is Afghanistan's population. And this is out of a population, mind you, of 13 million people when it started. It started with 13 million people, And the range of people who died is 5 to 2 million. And that's on top of 5 million refugees and 2 million internally displaced. And of course, this is Wikipedia. I could get you the actual PDFs. I don't want to put in the effort right now to go through the PDFs. And again, so what you have is about 100,000, or if you look at these, all these military casualties, 90,000 on the Mujahideen, and something like, what is it? We'll say 100 to 150,000 military casualties to 500,000 to 2 million civilians killed, 5 million refugees, 2 million internally displaced, and 3 million wounded. And we're talking wounds. We're not talking like they stubbed their toe. We're talking like a kid found a landmine, blow off his leg, and now he has to walk with a walker for the rest of his life. All these millions stacking on top of each other, and a country at the time made of only 13 million people. And so is it really surprising that when we see Afghanistan population, it drops that bad? This is a war of such utter brutality that is never talked about anymore. Ever. Ever. This is one of the most brutal wars to ever touch the Middle East, and it's never covered anymore because its relevance geopolitically for a lot of people isn't that prominent anymore. When you look at the American invasion of Afghanistan, which started in 2001, there's no dip. It just keeps going. Which is why, even though, of course, we have done some terrible things in Afghanistan, I would just point to the Afghanistan papers to show that. Like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was a catastrophic event for human life in the nation of Afghanistan. Not to mention, like, even if you wanted to, like, point to, like, possibly this being a dip, even though it's not a dip, or like maybe here or somewhere, it all still continues to go up. The entirety of the war, the Soviet-Afghan War, is just one large dip. So yeah. So you got 5 to 2 million civilians possibly. You got 500,000 to 2 million civilians dying. Then you've got 3 million wounded Afghan civilians. Then you've got 5 million refugees, 2 million internally displaced possibly. Of course, all these numbers are not 100. When you're working with numbers this big, it's not going to be 100% accurate. I'm just working off Wikipedia numbers. I could get the PDFs, but it's not going to be a ton off from what I'm saying right now. It's still going to be massive numbers we're working with. It's like if somebody says that 6 million or 8 million or 5 million died in the Holocaust, like, when you're working at that scale, it's too large to even, like, comprehend as a human being. And then you've got, like, 100,000 to 150,000, like a military casualties, possibly. Like, you're working with all these different ranges. Not to mention the infrastructural damage, the large-scale bombing campaign. And the reason why the civilian casualties were so large was due to the nature of the warfare, where the warfare was being held, the geography of the region, the types of weapons being used, and large-scale, basically like flatten-the-earth bombing raids. So, yeah, there you go. A lot of people don't know this, but yeah. Absolutely disgusting. You can call it what you want. You can say that, oh, the Soviet Union is coming in to protect this government, going over the assassination and the internal strife within Afghanistan, the domestic issues going on. Look, but the way it conducted itself within that country is nothing short of horrific. Okay, there you go. I guess when you look at the Russia, they look at this the same way we look at Afghanistan. I mean, the same way we look at Vietnam. The rest of the world doesn't really remember it, but we remember it because of how horrific it was. most of the world doesn't really remember the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, but they remember it because they remember what it was like. Even though our invasion of Vietnam, we actually lost a lot more troops than the Soviets did. We lost about like 70,000. They lost like 14,000 here. Man. This is absolutely bizarre. Isn't this bizarre? Okay, did any of you think it was this bad? Or is this like all information you guys already had? Because I'm always blown away by how little people know about the war. Did you guys already know all this? I've covered this a few times on stream, but every time I bring it up, I see like a million like Maka Omegas, you know? People who's never heard about this war before or never heard how brutal it is. Dylan, you taught me something new? Okay. So if anybody ever is like, what's like, if anybody's ever like, you know, the Soviet Union didn't like do like bad things overseas or like, just bring up the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. You can talk about Ukraine and the Holodomor. Or you can talk about, what it did to Czechoslovakia, Hungary. You could talk about any of these things. But one great example that's kind of hard to dispute is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. They'll try to make the domestic argument of the government asked them to come there, skipping over the assassination and the replacement and how the Soviets went in there specifically to back up the replacement. Like they'll skip over a lot of history, but this is undeniable. Like, yeah, like, you didn't know it was this bad. Like, this is not comparable to anything, any modern war in the Middle East. This is not comparable to any modern war in the Middle East. Like, the closest would be Syria, and even then, the only way it would be comparable, I think, would be refugees. I don't think it would be comparable when it comes to civilian death tolls. Let me see. Civilian. Let's look up Syrian civil war and see if they have like what they say on the Wikipedia. Because I've looked at the numbers when it comes to specific orgs and they differ. But let's see. Total killed 387. Yeah, no, it's not comparable. It's not comparable. It's not. That's the okay. Let me put it this way: the low end of the the low end of the Soviet civilian death toll alone is the high end of the Syrian civil war death toll, without including displaced person and all this other information. Just to give you perspective, the lowest possible civilian death count in Afghanistan is the highest possible total death count in Syria. Just to give you a perspective. That's crazy because Syria is the biggest humanitarian disaster in the last 10 to 20 years. Yeah, exactly. Which is why it's so disgusting that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is not talked about in the brutal terms that it should be. So the Syrian dip is more to do with people leaving the dying. Well, it does have to do with people dying. But if you look here, just go a little lower, 5 million refugees. A lot more refugees. And if you look here, this also had 5 million refugees. So the difference between the Syrian civil war and the Afghan civil war is it had the huge amount of refugees and in a much bigger possible like death toll. But it was also a much smaller country when it comes to population. Like if we look at Syria population right now, Afghanistan was at 13 million. Syria was at 21 million. So it was almost like 150% bigger, right? It was like at 21 million compared to 13 million. That's a difference of about 50%, right? Am I right there? About 50%? 100% of Afghanistan, you need 150. You need 150%. Yeah. Okay, yeah, my math. I'm terrible with math, but you guys wouldn't get what I'm saying. So this is all done, by the way, with a smaller population, a much smaller population. Anyway, why do you think history glosses over this conflict? Because it was the end of the Soviet Union, right? Because what was the most relevancy you could say this conflict has would be a possible Vietnam syndrome on Russia, which is kind of hard to argue for a lot of people exists when you see their involvement in Ukraine and Syria. But that's Vietnam syndrome didn't exist for them in that way. It might have to an extent, but is not existent in the same way now. It's complicated, but it's just not there. It's just not there in that way. And the only relevance it would have to, like, us, for example, as Americans who are already poorly educated in foreign policy issues, would be our invasion of Afghanistan. And like in comparison, and like, of course, like the funding of the Mujahideen would basically be the only thing. The really only time the Soviet war in Afghanistan gets brought up is when we talk about the funding of how we funded the Mujahideen. Never again. Like, it's just the funding of the Mujahideen, and then the conversation ends. We don't talk about like total death tolls at all. Was it not covered much in the media? No. It was covered in the media. I mean, remember, like, this is for the brave soldiers of the Mujahideen. It was covered. It's just like a thing of its time, you know? Like the Korean War. What's Vietnam syndrome? 1 second. Maybe I don't want to say it wrong, so let me just Google it soon. Quick. Vietnam syndrome. Vietnam syndrome, I believe, had to do with, like, the idea that, like, after getting involved in Vietnam, Americans were scared of getting involved in another conflict. Yeah, refers to public aversion to American overseas military involvement after domestic controversy over the Vietnam War. Basically, Americans were like, man, Vietnam really sucked. We kind of hate war, and we don't want to get involved in it, and you better have a really, 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 really good reason to go into war. That's basically what it was. Okay, I need to use the bathroom bad, so we're gonna actually end. You know, actually I could just play the news story. Yeah, I never actually got to finish it. Go back here. Okay, I'll finish this news story about the Taliban blowing up these old statues, these old Buddha statues, and I'll use the bathroom. Okay, be right back.